Derek Ernest Percy was unusual for a serial killer. He was only charged with one murder, that of 12-year-old Yvonne Elizabeth Tuohy, and found not guilty by reason of insanity. On the 7th of April 1970, he was sentenced to be detained indefinitely in prison at the pleasure of the Governor General, a ruling designed to protect the public, as it was clear that he had murdered a series of other children and, given the opportunity, was likely to do so again. Even when this indeterminate sentence was abolished in Australia in 1998, Percy was still not released, or even transferred to a mental hospital, as it was considered that he was not mentally ill, but rather had a personality disorder that was considered untreatable. Dr. Stevens, coordinator of forensic psychiatry services at Pentridge Prison in Melbourne, where he was held, wrote in 1984 that Percy was a highly dangerous sadistic pedophile who should never be released from safe custody. Continuing, he is not certifiable, neither is he psychiatrically treatable, and he is totally unsuited to a mental institution. Reviewing the case in Victoria's Supreme Court in 1998, Judge Jeffrey Eames refused to set a minimum sentence for Percy or a release date, despite Percy having served the 25-year term that was the state norm for insane criminals. Eames said that Percy had never been treated for his sadistic pedophilia, and nor had he sought treatment. He has demonstrated no significant remorse or anxiety, at least none which I find credible, as to the circumstances which caused him to kill, Justice Eames added. In March 2004, Percy's application to be transferred to a psychiatric hospital was turned down by Judge Murray Kellum, as he was not convinced that Percy didn't still have dangerous sexual fantasies about killing children, so he could not be allowed out of a maximum security facility. Later that year, Percy began a one-to-one sex offenders program in the hope that he might one day qualify for parole, but political opposition ensured that the parole board would never allow it. When he died of cancer in prison on the 24th of July 2013, Percy was the longest-serving prisoner in the state of Victoria. Still in a state of denial, he took the details of his killings to the grave with him. Sexually explicit diaries. That he had murdered Yvonne Tuohy was beyond dispute. She had been at Ski Beach in the small town of Warneet in western Port Bay, Victoria, on the 27th of July 1969 with her friend, 11-year-old Shane Spiller. Percy, then a 21-year-old naval rating, grabbed Tuohy and put a knife to her neck. He probably would have abducted Spiller as well, but the boy was carrying a tomahawk and waved it at Percy as he approached. Percy drove off with Tuohy. Spiller told the police that the car was a Datsun station wagon with a small Navy insignia in the back window. This led them to HMAS Cerberus, the Royal Australian Navy's training base nearby. 3 hours later, they found him there washing blood from his clothes, though he had been on weekend leave. In his locker, they discovered handwritten sexually explicit diaries describing his urges to sexually abuse, torture, murder, and mutilate children. They also found drawings of naked children and women. This led them to believe they were dealing with a serial killer. Another Warneet child, 10-year-old Sue Williams, had a lucky escape. Tuohy and Spiller invited her to join them at the beach, but she insisted she would have lunch first, then catch up. "It probably saved my life," she said. Percy's diaries showed that he intended to abduct 2 or 3 children at a time. The memory of what he had done seemed to be quickly receding from the killer's mind, but Detective Sergeant Richard Knight, who had completed a course in hypnotism, took Percy through the process in reverse, allowing the police to find Yvonne Tuohy's body, where he had dumped it 6 miles from the beach. She had been molested, tortured, and murdered. Her bathing costume had cuts around the crotch area, and there were injuries to her genitals, deep cuts to her throat, and her mouth was packed with fabric and paper in a way described in Percy's notebooks. Detective Bernie Delaney, another of the homicide investigators who charged Percy over the Tuohy murder, had no doubt Percy's apparent inability to remember was fake. When we first interviewed him, he denied it. Then he said he could have done it but couldn't remember, he said. And then he eventually took us to the scene in the dark on a drizzly July night. His "I can't remember" line was the perfect ploy, and so he never changed it. Veteran prison psychiatrist Dr. Alan Bartholomew described Percy as the nearest thing to a robot I have ever met, adding, "His behavior is above reproach, but what goes on in his mind, I have no idea." Another expert said he volunteered nothing, and extracting information was like pulling teeth. Child murders and abductions. Over the 4 years before the murder of Yvonne Tuohy, there had been a spate of child murders and abductions. Christine Sherrock and Marianne Schmidt, both 15, were murdered on Sydney's Wanda Beach on the 11th of January, 1965. 9-year-old Jane Beaumont, her 7-year-old sister Anna, and 4-year-old Grant disappeared from Glenelg Beach near Adelaide on the 26th of January, 1966. 6-year-old Alan Redston was murdered in Canberra on the 28th of September, 1966. 3-year-old Simon Brooke was killed in Sydney on the 18th of May, 1968. And 7-year-old Linda Stillwell was abducted from the St. Kilda foreshore in Melbourne on the 10th of August, 1968. In all these unsolved cases, a man answering to Percy's description had been seen nearby, or there was evidence that Percy had been in the vicinity. Also, there had been an attempted abduction of a 12-year-old girl near the Cerberus base on the 1st of April, 1969. The victim identified Percy after his arrest. Detective Knight had already concluded that the murder of Yvonne Tuohy was not Percy's first attack, and took the unusual decision to put a rookie cop on the case. The young policeman had been on the force for just 6 months, but he had been at school with Percy. Sobbing, Percy told him, "Looks like I've fucked up this time." Asked if there were others, Percy said typically, "I can't remember." The rookie cop pressed on. "Well, look, Derek, I'll ask you about some of the ones that I know about," he said. "You don't have to say anything. If you remember, I will jot it down, and it could be used in court." Asked about Linda Stillwell, Percy made a telling admission. "Yes," he said, "I drove through St. Kilda that day. I had been at Cerberus in the afternoon and was driving along the esplanade on the way to the White Ensign Club for some drinks." When asked if he killed her, he said, "Possibly, I don't remember a thing about it." Percy also admitted to being in Sydney on the day Simon Brooke was killed. He had been giving his brother a lift to work and had driven past the spot where the body was found. Did he remember killing him? "I wish I could. I might have. I just don't remember," Percy said. Asked if he was in Adelaide when the Beaumont children, Jane, Anna, and Grant, went missing, he said, "I don't know." He was then asked if he was blocking out thoughts because something horrible happened in Adelaide and you don't want to remember it. He said it was possible. He also said he could not remember if he had killed the children and volunteered no further information. Nevertheless, over the years, cold case investigations have turned up other evidence that points to Percy as the perpetrator in all these cases. Derek Ernest Percy was born on the 15th of September, 1948 in Strathfield, New South Wales. He was the eldest son of a railway electrician who moved his young family to Warrnambool on the coast of Victoria. Father and son shared a passion for sailing. The Percys took caravan holidays, often traveling interstate to yachting competitions in their V8 Studebaker. In 1961, they moved on to Mount Beauty, near Bright in Victoria. Derek went to Mount Beauty High School, where he had few friends. He wore a green and gold striped tie like the other pupils, but his was made from a cheaper, coarser fabric, and he was teased. He had few friends. One of them was a local farmer's boy who had also just moved to town. Interviewed by the police a decade later, he said, "One thing that stood out about Derek was that he was very intelligent. Most or nearly all of us at school had to work and study very hard, but not Derek." He also noted that Percy was shy and never had a girlfriend. Banned by his parents from playing football, Percy would sometimes borrow his friend's kit, convincing his mate's mother to wash the clothes so his parents wouldn't know. It was said that his parents were overprotective, as one of his younger brothers had died of diphtheria aged just 10 months. Derek might have been the eldest of the 3 surviving sons, but his younger siblings were given their freedom while their mother kept him on a tighter rein. Derek had to get permission to go anywhere with us outside of school hours, and she would question his intentions, his younger brother said. He earned his pocket money working in the tobacco fields, saving up to buy a second-hand bicycle with Ramshorn handlebars. He also carried a sharp pocket knife, which was not unusual in the countryside of Victoria. One day he was helping a friend make running repairs on the sole of his shoe during a handball game. "I remember Derek getting his pocket knife out and telling me that he would cut it off," said the friend. "Derek began to cut the sole off my shoe, and all of a sudden, the blade went into Derek's left thigh about 3/4 of an inch. The blade went deeply into his thigh, and I recoiled in surprise. I was amazed that Derek just looked fascinated with what had happened. He didn't scream, cry, or really show any sort of emotion that you would expect from someone with a knife in their leg. I thought his reaction was extremely odd. He seemed happy about it." In 1964, in Mount Beauty, Percy began stealing women's underwear from washing lines. The local newspaper nicknamed the culprit the Snowdropper. He was also suspected of being a peeping Tom. Until then, he had been doing well at school, but his grades began dropping, though he had an IQ of 122. Out near a local swimming pond, 2 teenagers saw what they thought was a girl in a petticoat. It turned out to be Percy in a stolen negligee. He then began slashing at the clothing and stabbed at the crotch in a similar way to what he would do to Yvonne Tuohy. I would describe Derek's eyes as being full of excitement, a glazed look, but I recall there was something very cold and sinister in the look, one of the teenagers told police later. Underwear and dresses were stolen from the wardrobes of 2 little girls who lived next door. Some were found under bushes along with one of their dolls whose eyes had been blinded, and pictures of women in bikini whose eyes had been scribbled over with pencil and whose bodies were slashed with a razor blade. In his entry in the Mount Beauty School magazine, Percy said his favorite saying was, "It depends." Perpetual occupation, isolating myself. Ambition, playboy. Probable fate, bachelor. Pet aversion, girls. Despite his high IQ, he failed his exams. When his family moved to Concoban, the snowdropping stopped in Mount Beauty and began again there. Things took a more serious turn when he lured a 6-year-old girl into the family caravan and sexually assaulted her. Her father took the matter up with Derek's dad, who was already worried about his son after finding him dressed in women's clothing. It was also found he was committing bizarre and violent sexual fantasies to paper, a practice he would continue for the rest of his life. More deviant ramblings were found by his grandmother and burnt. Typically for a serial killer, he had tortured animals as a child. It was recommended that he visit a psychologist, but he failed to do so. Having dropped out of school, he went to work at a service station his father had bought. This did not work out, and in 1967, he joined the Navy, graduating at the top of his entry class. But it was soon found that he wasn't suitable officer material. One could see why. Tim Attrell, who served with Percy in the Navy and later became a police inspector, described him as one of the most intelligent people I've met. He is cold, without emotion, and looks straight through you with his crazy eyes. Some 40 years later, the police pieced together the details of his family holidays, which showed he was near the places where children had been abducted and murdered in the late 1960s. On the 11th of January 1965, teenagers Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sherrock had gone to Sydney's popular Cronulla Beach area with Marianne's 4 younger siblings. After a picnic, the younger children stayed in a sheltered area at Wanda Beach, while the 2 15-year-olds went off. Marianne's 2 younger brothers saw them talking to a fair-haired youth who was carrying a spear and had a knife in a sheath. The girls' mutilated bodies were found the next day, partially buried near a sand dune. As in the Tuohy case, the victims had been taken from the beach and their bodies dumped nearby. The crotch area of one of the girls' swimming costumes had been cut, just as Percy had been seen slashing female underwear at Mount Beauty a few weeks earlier. Neighbors confirmed that the Percys had visited Sydney for a holiday that summer. They had gone to attend the National Yachting Regatta at Botany Bay Yachting Club, which was near Wanda Beach. Percy's grandparents lived a short distance from the West Ryde railway station where the 2 girls had caught the train on their way to the beach. After police arrested Percy, they found the diary that described his urges to sexually abuse, torture, murder, and mutilate children. In it, he had written that he would force his victims to drink beer. Christine Sherrock's post-mortem showed that she had a blood alcohol level equivalent to drinking about half a pint of beer. He also wrote about abducting and killing 2 girls at Barnsley, a beach in northern New South Wales. Police believed this was code for Wanda Beach. When Percy started a new school that year, a classmate spotted his resemblance to the photo fit released in the case of the 2 missing girls. Fellow students taunted him, saying, "We know it was you that killed those girls in Sydney. You have the same haircut, and we know you were there." At the suggestion, Percy went berserk and challenged them to a fight. The day the Beaumont children went missing, they were seen talking to a man at about 11 a.m. 45 minutes later, they bought a pie and 2 pastries with a $1 note, which was more than the pocket money their mother had given them. Percy also wrote about giving children food before kidnapping and killing them. His brother confirmed that the family had been in Adelaide at that time. Their bodies had never been found. However, given his modus operandi, Percy remained a person of interest in the case and was at the top of the police shortlist of suspects. That summer, he forced his neighbors, Tanya and Lynette Harrison, to show him their genitals. On the 27th of September 1966, 6-year-old Alan Jeffrey Redston left his home in the Canberra suburb of Curtin to go to a nearby milk bar to buy an ice cream. The next day, his body was found in reeds by a local creek. The body was hogtied and had plastic wrapped around the throat. In the days leading up to the murder, a fair-haired teenager had been play fighting with boys, forcing them to the ground, tying them up and placing plastic bags over their heads in an apparent attempt to suffocate them. Percy wrote about tying up victims and using plastic to asphyxiate them. Yvonne Tuohy was bound and gagged when she was found. When Percy was a child, as a punishment, his grandmother would lock him in a room and hog-tie him the way Alan Redston's body had been. The identikit composed from witness accounts closely resembled Percy, and a man in the vicinity was seen riding a red bike with ram's horn handlebars, exactly like the one Percy owned and took with him on caravan holidays. He admitted that the family were in Canberra at the time. They had a relative there. A green and gold striped tie made of a coarse cloth was found at the scene of the crime. Percy no longer needed his Mount Beauty tie as he had changed school. In November 1967, Percy joined the Navy. On his electrical mechanics course, he was nicknamed the Ghost. After 3 months in the Navy, he was posted to sentry duty on the aircraft carrier HMS Melbourne, which was undergoing a refit in Cockatoo Dry Dock at Sydney Harbour. On his daily commute from the naval base on Garden Island, where he was stationed, he passed through the suburb of Glebe. On the 18th of May, 1968, 3-year-old Simon Brooke went missing from the front yard of his family home there. The house was next to Jubilee Park, where a truck driver said he saw a boy matching Simon Brooke's description holding hands with a young man. The identikit closely resembled Percy and had a neat haircut, as would have been required by naval regulations. The following day, the boy's body was found under a tree, half naked and mutilated. Some of the wounds the killer had inflicted were similar to those suffered by Yvonne Tuohy, and the 2 Gillette razor blades found at the scene were the same brand as those issued to sailors. In his diary, Percy wrote of abducting and killing a 3-year-old child and detailed the exact injuries inflicted on Simon Brooke. Detectives took this to be a virtual confession. When the inquest into Simon Brooke's death was reopened in 2005, Percy refused to give evidence on the grounds of self-incrimination. The coroner concluded that there was a reasonable prospect that a jury would convict a known person in relation to the offense. Percy had transferred to the troopship HMS Sydney, which was based in Melbourne, on the 1st of July, 1968. On the 5th of August 1968, he took 18 days leave. 5 days later, 7-year-old Linda Stillwell's mother told her to go and find her brother and sister and bring them home for lunch. They returned without her. 2 days later, a woman called to say that she had seen a girl matching Linda's description rolling down a grassy hill near Melbourne's Lower Esplanade. There was a man nearby wearing a deep navy blue, almost black spray jacket, similar to that worn when sailing. After Percy was arrested for the Tuohy abduction, and his picture was printed in the newspaper, the woman came forward again, saying that she was absolutely certain that Percy was the man she had seen in the spray jacket. I got the biggest shock of my life. This was the same man that was sitting on the park bench the day that the little Stillwell girl disappeared in St. Kilda, she said. In the 44 years Percy was in jail, he was paid his Navy pension, amassing $200,000, some of which he used to pay for his defense. He also paid for the storage of 35 boxes of newspaper articles on sex crimes, pictures of children, a video with a rape theme, and handwritten stories on sex offenses involving abduction and torture. Among them, police found a 1978 street directory with a line drawn through St. Kilda Pier, where Linda Stillwell was abducted, and a pornographic lesbian cartoon on which Percy wrote the word Wanda across the top. There was one final unsung victim, Shane Spiller. He was just 11 when, after his friend Yvonne Tuohy was abducted, he was asked to pick out the man he had seen from a police lineup. I had to walk up and point right at his nose, the look he gave me. I can still remember it, he said years later. He was plagued by the idea that while he was still alive, Percy might one day be freed and come and get him. I was promised back then that he would never get out, he said. I hope people don't forget what he was like and what he did. They always thought he'd killed others, but they weren't able to prove it. In 2000, Shane applied for criminal compensation. He was awarded $5,000, which was increased to $50,000 on appeal, the maximum that could be awarded under the criminal compensation scheme. 2 years later, he disappeared from his house in the town of Wyndham, New South Wales, where he had lived for years. His car was still parked at the front, and squatters had moved into the house. A resident who knew him said, "He was always saying someone was after him. No one knows what happened to him." A local publican said, "He was really scared. He told me that one day he might just take off." Some believed that he was murdered for his compensation payout. He was, however, safe from Percy, who never got out.